Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to spend some time in this first hour talking about apologetics and really the idea of whether or not you are qualified to make a difference in your world. I think you'll really enjoy this as we talk about this documentary about Norm Geisler, Not Qualified. Next hour, we're going to be talking with the former governor of the state of Tennessee, Bill Haslam. His book is entitled Faithful Presence, The Promise and Peril of Faith in the Public Square. And then we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. But let me just start off by saying we won't get into this in much detail for about 90 minutes, but as you may know, can't imagine you don't know by now, order handed down by the U.S. District Judge, that'd be Catherine Kimball Mizell, saying that the attempt to continually postpone the mask mandate by the CDC and by the Biden administration actually violated what's called the Administrative Procedures Act, and there was no reason to continue doing that, so the mask mandate is no longer. And that, by the way, was announced on some airplanes where people were videotaping the response, which was kind of interesting. And we'll get into that in more detail a little bit later, but I did want to start out by saying that we will get into that conversation and a couple of other very important issues that we have posted on our website at pointofview.net. Let's first of all go to our friend Dr. David Geisler. He's been on the program many times with us before, was the president and co-founder of what is called Norm Geisler Ministries, and you can find information about that. We also have a link to normgeislerthemovie.com, but again, you don't have to remember all that because we have it on our website. Co-authored the book Conversational Evangelism with his late father, individual that actually speaks and teaches at a number of seminaries founded by his father, Southern Evangelical Seminary, as well as Veritas International University, has been a missionary to Asia for quite some time, been training all sorts of students on practical apologetics, a graduate from Dallas Theological Seminary with 2 master's degrees, one in biblical studies, one in theology, and holds a doctor of ministry in apologetics from Southern Evangelical Seminary. Dr. David Geisler, thank you so very much for being with us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby. Great to be with you today.
We are going to spend most of our time talking about the movie and the documentary, and I think this will be an encouragement to people who might say, I just really don't feel qualified to actually teach a Sunday school class. I don't know if I could actually work with Child Evangelism Fellowship because I'm not really good with kids. I really am not sure that I should go across the street and witness to my friend and neighbor because, after all, I don't know if I can answer all the questions. In some respects, the documentary is quite a history, but it's really based on the fact that your father, we always know him as an individual that had more than, I don't forget what the actual final total was, 80 plus books. There was a time,
125, I think it was.
Well, again, who's counting at that point? But the bottom line is, if you look at his early life, there was no evidence at all that he would be the individual that he was. And that's, in a sense, why you wrote the documentary and did it, isn't it?
Exactly. My father was practically illiterate until he was 17 years old. And then God kind of did this amazing thing in his life and basically told him he was going to become a scholar. And that's exactly, he wrote 125 books and raised a whole generation of Christian leaders like William Lane Craig, Gary Habermas. A lot of his students are Christian leaders today, and we're, so much better off because of what God did in his life when he felt not qualified at the very beginning of his spiritual journey.
And one of the things he's oftentimes said when he was alive is that one of the things that really created this golden age of apologetics, because we talk about it so often here on Point of View, was the fact that you had a guy by the name of Josh McDowell traveling around and speaking. And, of course, I met Josh McDowell in 1974 because I was vice president of the student body, met him, introduced him to an outreach, and then got his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And as I'm looking through that, I'm seeing this book on General Introduction to the Bible by Norm Geisler and William Mix, and I'm thinking, okay, and so I ordered that book. Back in the days when we didn't have Amazon, ladies and gentlemen, it took a little longer to get the book. Then I started looking up other articles that appeared, and so when it came time for me to actually edit my first book at Probe Ministries, interestingly enough, they said, well, why don't you edit this book by Norm Geisler, which later became Roots of Evil, and it needed some work, and I've put together an opening chapter and a few things like that, and then he, of course, moved down to Dallas. We did debates together. We did also, as a matter of fact, we wrote a book together and a number of other things, and yet a lot of that goes back to the initial kind of interest in need for apologetics, which today, if I have younger listeners, they might think, oh, people always have been interested in that. And you can remember a time when if you said the word, people would look at you like you made that word up, right?
Exactly. And you actually wrote a great book with my dad, Origin Science. Is that still in print?
I think it's finally gone out of print, and your dad and I were talking about maybe updating it. Of course, I've taken a lot of the ideas there, and they've ended up in other books, and of course ended up in some of his books as well. But, debates on creation evolution that we did together, testifying in Arkansas on the idea of teaching origins, all sorts of other aspects of that. But again, take us back to the beginning, because he didn't grow up in a household where there were lots of books and lots of people looking at these kind of philosophical issues that today you took for granted growing up in that household.
Right. He grew up in a very poor household, and like I said, he was practically illiterate till he was 17. And when he became a Christian at the age 17, he realized that he needed to get some answers to some of the questions. He was involved with, I think it was Youth for Christ, a spinoff of Billy Graham Association, and they were witnessing on street corners in Detroit. And there were people that basically asked him questions and he didn't know the answers to. And that sent my dad on a 20-year adventure in education and finding answers. And it ended up, he got a PhD in philosophy, and then he felt like after 20 years, he was finally ready to witness on the streets of Detroit and other places, which I think is a fascinating story in and of itself.
Let's talk about that. I need to take a break, but let me just mention that we have a link, first of all, to the outstanding organization that actually David and his father put together. So we have that link for you, and you can click on his picture, and that will take you to RGIM, which stands for Norm Geisler International Ministries, Apologetics, Evangelism, and Discipleship. And so that is a great resource for you. But then we also have a link to the movie, and we haven't spent much time talking about it, but we will, and that's normgeislerthemovie.com. But again, those links already on the website. And of course, they've had a premiere that appeared on National Religious Broadcaster TV's network and some others. So we're going to talk about various ways in which you can see the movie and also maybe pass it on to others. So we have a lot to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
2 years ago, I did a commentary on how progressive activists were using the cancel culture to destroy the lives of individuals and drive small businesses into bankruptcy. One of the examples I cited was the plight of Gibson's Bakery. Although it has taken years, the bakery has finally won. The Ninth District Court of Appeals ruled unanimously in favor of the bakery that accused Oberlin College of damaging its business and libeling it with false accusations of racism. The incident occurred in 2016, and the owners sued in 2017. A county judge ruled in their favor in 2019, and the appeals just came down in 2022. Sometimes the wheels of justice grind very slowly. The son of the bakery owner stopped 3 black Oberlin students because one of them was stealing wine bottles from the store. Students started protesting the bakery after the arrest by handing out flyers outside the store calling it a racist establishment with a history of racial profiling. The student senate passed a resolution accusing the bakery owners of being racist and emailed that resolution to all the students. And Oberlin College, who regularly purchased baked goods from the bakery for the dining hall, all of a sudden suspended its purchasing for at least a month after the incident. The Gibsons denied any wrongdoing and asked for a public apology from the college in order to repair the damage to their reputation. But apparently they never received one. When we discussed this case on my radio program, one of my guests applauded the bakery's response. Because, too often, victims of cancel culture cower in fear even when they haven't done anything wrong. So the bakery, I think, illustrates what happens when you stand up for your rights and stand up for your reputation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
David Geisler with us, and again, president and co-founder of the Norm Geisler International Ministries. We, of course, have a link to that website. But, David, for just a few minutes, again, we'll talk about your father as we go along, but the documentary is one I wanted to focus some time and attention on because that's one of the reasons we wanted to have you on. You've had an opportunity to show this documentary on the National Religious Broadcasters Network, NRB TV. You've had some premieres, but I would like to make it available to our listeners, and so we have a link to normgeislerthemovie.com. But explain that, because you had not only, of course, pulled together some great stories about Norm Geisler, and I'm probably going to tell a few more before we're done here, but you also have been able to interview kind of a who's who of people all over the world, certainly all over this country, that have been profoundly influenced by your father.
Exactly, and I remember talking to Josh McDowell for the movie, and he said something really profound, and that came out in the movie. He said that Norm realized that if you let inerrancy slip, that every other doctrine will slip intellectually, and things like that. Andy Stanley, he had interviews with Andy Stanley. He had interviews with John Ankerberg. We had interviews with John Ankerberg. There was just a lot of godly men that we had the privilege. And I found something out when I interviewed Ron Rhodes. I don't know if you know this story, that Dr. John Walvoord, the late president of Dallas Theological Seminary, hired my dad because he knows that conservative seminaries tend to drift, and he hired my dad to keep that from happening. And I just thought that was an interesting story. But I learned a lot of things about my father through this movie, and the impact that he had on a whole generation of Christian leaders. And what we're trying to do with this movie is get it out all over the country so that people can kind of watch it and, think through what is it that Norm did in the 60s through the 90s that helped him stand against the secular humanism of the time, and what is it then we need to do today that will help us to respond better to the culture in which we lived. And of course, we don't just give the movie, we have a whole package of materials because, my personal desire is to re-equip the body of Christ all over the globe with the materials that Norm Geisler left all of us.
And again, as you pointed out, it was really a story of dealing with the culture from the 60s to the 90s, the kind of the tsunami of secular humanism and atheism and the rest. But I love one of the quotes in the movie that comes from Dr. Ed Heinzen, used to be, of course, Dean at Liberty University School of Theology. He said much of what Norm Geisler wanted to say to the 20th century, he was really speaking to the 21st century, and it needs to be heard today. So even though you might say, well, some of these were battles back then, inerrancy, creation, origins, the whole idea of sexual identity and the rest, in some respects, we were addressing those issues at the time, and we've seen the full flowering of those ideas in a negative sort of way now in the 21st century, haven't we?
Exactly. And back then, my dad was actually battling the issue that people were denying that you could even know reality. Yes. It wasn't just that they were denying that the Bible was not God's word or that God didn't exist. They were denying that you can know anything. And so that was very important for my father to, engage the culture in those days to try to turn that secular humanistic perspective back. And unfortunately, I think there weren't enough people like my dad at the time in the early 60s and 70s so that our culture did kind of move on. And that's why from 1960 to 1990, we saw that the Supreme Court had decided that creation, and God-given moral values cannot be taught in the public school. And my dad tried to help, stop all those things. And he just, there weren't enough people to actually stop what happened in our culture. And now it's even worse. We're dealing with things that I could have never dreamed about growing up, that we would struggle with the idea of whether I'm a male or a female. It never even occurred to me that would be a problem. But you see, if knowledge is something that starts in our head, we determine what reality is instead of what Aquinas said. Reality is out there. There is truth corresponds to reality. No wonder why people are so messed up today. Because they didn't listen to Norm Geisler.
Well, you said something in passing. It's worth maybe talking about that because the church kind of disengaged in the 1960s. We had a counter-revolution. This was the idea of the sexual revolution and all the rest. And it does seem to me that we can lament that the church disengaged in the 60s and 70s, and I'm certainly aware of that. But there's a lesson to be learned. We need to re-engage, and it seems to me that we are supposed to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, and it seems to me that this documentary might be an encouragement to maybe a whole generation of young people to say, wait a minute, I really have a responsibility here to defend biblical authority, because if I don't, I can already around me see what happens when people turn their back on God and turn their back on biblical authority.
That is so true. And one of the things that I discovered personally when in making this movie, Kerby, is that my dad had discovered in the 60s and 70s by understanding, reading Aquinas and understanding philosophy in a deeper way, he discovered three specific things. One, that all truth was God's truth, and so we could find common ground in witnessing to people other than starting with the Bible as the Word of God. Secondly, he discovered that faith and reason are more compatible than many Christians realize. And that third, that there was a proper use of apologetics in our witness. And we need to understand what that is. And I'll be honest, I'm a little bit surprised that I talk to pastors sometimes, and they don't even seem to understand some of these simple ideas that my father taught all his life. And I'm thinking, what happened to the church? Why don't people understand there's a difference between belief that and belief in, and that apologetics bears on the question of belief that, but not belief in. And so when we're witnessing to people, we have to make that distinction and help them to think through, is there evidence to believe that it's true? And that involves apologetics. But to believe in Christ is a matter of volitional choice. And we know from John 6:65 and 1 Corinthians 12:3 that it's the Holy Spirit that works on people's hearts. And so it's not just my persuasive words or the Holy Spirit, it's both. Somehow, Kerby, we're not teaching that today. And I'm hoping to use this movie as I travel around the country, not only show the movie, do a Q&A time, but then do some training and helping churches to get a hold of some of these really basic ideas that my father taught all his life. And unfortunately, our churches aren't equipped still.
Well, again, that's why you have written the book on conversational evangelism, and I know you have such a great training regimen there and some great material that can be done. So if an individual says, well, I'd like to watch the movie, they can find that link there, but I think you are also appealing to maybe some pastors, Sunday school teachers, church leaders, deacons, maybe elders who might say, this would really be good for our church. If we really want to be involved in evangelism, we really want to be able to answer the questions that people are asking and provide an opportunity for people to really understand the gospel, we need to have you come. So they can contact you to do that as well, don't they?
Exactly. All they have to do is email us at movie@njam.org. Movie at N as in Norman, G as in Geisler, IM.org. And my goal in the next couple of years is just to travel the country, show the movie, and invite pastors to come to a Q&A after the movie so that we can get some of these resources in their hands. And some of them, Kerby, are free. I don't know if you're aware that we now have a conversational evangelism app that was developed by one of my doctoral students, and it was just recommended by J. Warner Wallace. I just got an email from.
Let's talk about that right after the break, because I want to focus on that for just a minute too. But we need to take a mandatory break. We'll talk about the app, talk about some other aspects of the movie. All that coming up right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. David Geisler. And if you would like to join the conversation, maybe you have a question about evangelism, maybe you're witnessing to someone, issue of apologetics, perhaps even want to give a testimony of the impact that various individuals that were trained by Norm Geisler have had in your life. Love to hear from you, 1-800-351-1212. But you might sit back for just a minute, get something to write with, because first of all, David, I went to my app store just to double check, and if you type in either Conversational Evangelism or Norm Geisler International Ministries. Anyway, you get your app, and the app is a very useful resource that you can have on your phone. And as you said, this is a way in which you can talk about conversational evangelism, how to answer some of these questions, maybe how to talk about Jesus. There are videos to be seen. There are other resources, but talk about what people will find if indeed they load this particular conversational evangelism app on their phone, because I think it would be just very indispensable, if you will, if you're going to be involved in sharing Christ with other individuals in your sphere of influence.
Exactly. And one of my former Doctor of Ministry students, Pastor Matthew Dodd, who's a pastor in Portland, Oregon, he did this project. He took everything I taught him in class and the book that my father and I wrote together and developed it. And especially the parts you ought to look at is all the way on the bottom where he has this workbook that's about 50 pages and 7 video messages that he did. And he is just an amazing pastor and passionate about evangelism. So, one of the things that I'm trying to do is mentor and disciple more people to pass on what I've learned from my father and what I've been teaching in the area of witnessing for over 30 plus years.
So again, a great resource. You can find these on the website because we've provided some of that for you. But if you are looking for the app, probably the best way to go is just go to your app store, wherever it might be, and find it. But again, you can find some of the links about that at, again, Norm Geisler International Ministries, which is ngim.org. There's a place where you can connect up with David, and that is a way that you could then maybe schedule him to come and speak. There's a list of the various books. There's a store there, resources, and a lot of other aspects as well. And, we just a minute ago, we're talking about the similarities in some respects between the 60s and the 21st century. And later on, David, after you are gone, in this last half hour, one of the articles I've posted is by Michael Brown, and he actually is talking about something I mentioned yesterday, and that is you go back to 1966, just 2 days before Easter. Time magazine had a cover story that said, "Is God Dead?" And of course, over the years, we've seen some of these anti-God, anti-Christian various editorials that appeared in Time and Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, and all the rest. And some of those have sort of faded away because the magazines have. But just the other day, when you had something very unusual, you had not only Easter, you had, of course, Good Friday, you have the beginning of Passover, and you also have Ramadan. So you have basically the 3 major theistic world religions all celebrating at the same time. What did the New York Times decide to do? Well, they posted an op-ed by an individual that said, "I propose that we give up on God," or give up God, and basically argue that if God were mortal, I would take him before the Hague because he is back. And you've heard this before from the so-called new atheist, a genocidal maniac. We talked about that yesterday with Paul Copan. But it was kind of interesting that here we go again. These issues that your dad and I were dealing with. I remember one time your dad and I were actually doing a debate with atheists. And just before the debate, he said, "Let's get together and pray." So we prayed, and I prayed, and then he prayed pray to God, I pray that you will confuse the minds of these individuals. And I remember looking up going, can you do that? And it turns out that the person that was debating me was with actually, he was debating the person with the American Humanist Association. I was debating an evolutionist. But anyway, he just got so fumbled and confused and all the rest. And I remember many of those debates, either ones that I moderated, ones that I participated in with him, or sometimes when I was just in the audience. And this whole confrontation that oftentimes took place with our atheist friends is really taking place even more so today in the 21st century. So in some respects, I think some of the books that your father has written and some of the material that you've put together on conversational evangelism is probably even more appropriate now than it was a few decades ago.
Exactly. And one of the books I'm really trying to get Christians to read, which is the hardest book they'll ever read, is Christian Apologetics. I remember I read that twice before I actually understood what it was saying, that the first part is a criteria for truth with different worldviews. Once you establish that undeniability is, the principle for determining what is true, and unaffirmability is the principle for determining what is false, then you come to theism, and then you can look at the evidence. But it's a great book, and I encourage Christians to get it. Now, I'll be honest with you, Kerby. I don't really follow my dad's footsteps when I'm talking to a skeptic or an atheist at the very beginning of my conversation. I do what's called light apologetics. Actually, my father did teach me that principle. And one of the things that I will do when I'm talking to a skeptic or an atheist is just ask a simple question. Do you know who Anthony Flew was? Mm-hmm. Anthony Flew was one of the greatest atheistic philosophers of the 20th century. But did you know before he died, he gave up his atheism? Do you know why? He actually wrote a book.
Yeah.
Right? There is a God. And I find that sometimes just a question, a thought-provoking question like that, can help you to know where you need to go in the conversation, so you don't have to start with all this heavy apologetics.
Right.
But you may have to bring it out. And so I encourage people to start light, and then when people respond in certain kinds of ways that you need more of what my father taught, then bring those deeper arguments out. I discovered even that there was a skeptic who was basically debating all these Christians, and these Christians were not using my dad's two forms of the cosmological argument, the argument from beginning causality and current or sustaining causality. And I noticed they didn't do as well when they didn't follow Norm Geisler's advice. And that's kind of the theme of this movie, is we want people to hear what Norm said and encourage them to consider doing some of the things that he said that we need to do, and some things that we need to learn.
Well, let's take some phone calls. We'll head out to Georgia first, listening on the Good News Network. Alberto, you're on with David Geisler.
David, Kerby, appreciate the show. Thank you for your ministry. Just wanted to make a comment and kind of get your feedback on the back end. I've been saved since 1988, September 22nd. Met the Lord in a small country church in Malden, South Carolina. My pastor, Dr. Bill McDonald, and my Sunday school teacher, Bob Kraut, taught me the Word of God. And I've always had a hunger to share the gospel. We know that Jesus' message was to repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And we know that the scriptures teach that no one will come to God unless the Holy Spirit draws them. Something happened in that upper room with the apostles when we know that the scriptures teach that when you receive power, then you will be my witnesses. I was recently in Salt Lake City, Utah at Temple Mount, and I had a chance to minister to some sisters there of the Mormon faith right there at their main temple. And they proposed to me the Book of Mormon, and they told me that it was another testament of Jesus Christ. And I asked them the question there at the Temple Square, where they claim that is the world headquarters for the Christian church. I asked them, what did Jesus say a person must do to be saved? and they could not answer the question. And one of the great things that I'm concerned about today in churches, and I see this even in this past Sunday, Resurrection Sunday service, that the plan of salvation was not even offered for people to hear, let the Holy Spirit move on their heart and believe that the Lord came to save them. And my fear is that not only are we not evangelizing, but we are not sharing the complete gospel.
Okay, let me take a break, and when we come back, David, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, because in some respects, I think you would agree that there is a real need to train more people in this area of evangelism and apologetics, and of course, that's what you're doing. So let's take a break, and if you'd like to join the conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll continue our conversation with David Geisler right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. We have David Geisler with us. Let me mention again the movie that we're talking about, which you may want to actually have access to, or actually have Dr. David Geisler come and speak and show the movie. Not qualified, of course, the story of Norm Geisler. But I think Alberto raised a very good question that I think illustrates exactly why you do what you do. We find a situation in which oftentimes, even in some of these churches that are evangelical, evangelical churches, they want to be, quote, seeker sensitive, so they don't even necessarily present the plan of salvation. Or maybe they do, but then when it comes time for individuals who come forward and are still maybe having some questions, because as your father used to say, and I use it all the time, the heart cannot accept what the mind rejects. So sometimes people come up with excuses, but sometimes these are really concerning issues that deserve some attention. We need to equip the church in the 21st century to be a force for evangelism and discipleship, and a key part of that, of course, is apologetics, isn't it?
Exactly. And I would say to the person who spoke that one of the things we want to keep in mind is in our conversations with people, we want to ask questions that get them to doubt what it is that they're believing in. I remember talking to a head Mormon on a plane one day, and I asked him about the infinite progression of gods. I said, don't you have to start somewhere? Because if, like Norm Geisler says, if something exists and something can't come from nothing, then something must have always existed. Because if there ever was a time in the beginning when there was nothing, there'd still be nothing. You can't have an infinite progression of finite gods. It's just not even possible. And he didn't even have an explanation for me. He said, well, I know one teacher at Brigham Young that might have an answer for you. And so I just asked him a simple question to make him doubt. And that's one of the things that my father and I talk about in our book, Conversational Evangelism. It's the 3 Ds, where you learn to ask questions in a way that surface doubt, that minimize defensiveness, but most importantly, Kerby, that create a desire on their part to actually continue the conversation. And that's what Jesus did with the woman at the well in John chapter 4. He asked her questions and said, if you drink of the water that I give you, you'll never be thirsty again. So I'd encourage people to pick up my father's 12 Points book, pick up our Conversational Evangelism book, and then the other book we recommend for discipleship is my friend Edmund Chen, A Certain Kind.
Yes.
And I'm trying to teach church leaders to integrate their apologetics and evangelism and discipleship, and that's what Norm Geisler International Ministries is now focusing on.
I might just mention again that we have a link to that. Of course, you can find it as well by just going to rgim.org. Go to the book section. First one there listed is Christian Apologetics, we just talked about. Another one that you just mentioned, 12 Points That Show Christianity is True, and then the one on conversational evangelism, but then many of these other great books by Norm Geisler, and of course, the one that you two wrote together, very important. So again, that is at the store. Let me for just a minute then talk about when we go to that website, you've got about a 20-minute presentation on connecting with people to share Jesus, and that gives people a chance to know kind of what you would do if you were to show up at a church. Then you have, if you will, kind of a 1-minute trailer, video trailer on the movie, a commercial for Norm Geisler Not Qualified, as well as then the links for some of the resources, which include the App Store material, the app that you can download right there, and a number of other resources, as well as just an incredible amount of material on apologetics, evangelism, and discipleship. So that is a resource that I wanted people to be aware of. Even as we are talking about the movie, there are so many other things that people can find because you have really filled it out with some very essential tools to help people be equipped to make a difference here in the 21st century.
Well, and right now we have a 40% discount coupon if they just go to normgeislerthemovie.com and they want to show the movie in their church and get all these resources we have with it. They just have to put in the code qualified by God 20. That's all they need to do. And they can get a discount for the movie. And hopefully they'll be able to use the movie and the workbook that we have with it to train a new generation in their church that never heard of Norm Geisler, but they can teach them some of these basic Christian faith and reason principles that we need to teach people in order for them to be more effective, stronger roots, and more effective in reaching the lost around them.
Might mention, you have a link there to bring this movie to your city. So again, a church might say, this might be something really be good to show to all the youth and have that conversation. So that's a possibility as well, to be able to show that, use the workbook, maybe even use it for a small group. I know that one of the things we have, David, are a number of people that have small group gatherings, and a small group leader might say, maybe it's about time we talk about this idea of evangelism and how to be able to defend the Christian faith. So they could show the movie and then over the series of weeks go through some of the material in the workbook, or show clips from the movie and use that in a way to really educate people. And you've used that before as well, haven't you?
Exactly. And we have set up the movie in such a way that we send people the links to the sections of the movie so that they can do group studies on their laptops, or once people show the movie and then they want to go deeper into these areas. And some of the things I mentioned about faith and reason and apologetics and evangelism and discipleship, these are also tools we're developing to go with the movie, so that churches can just at least have an understanding of some of the things that my father discovered in the 60s and 70s that will help them to deal with the tsunami of postmodernism that we're dealing with today, and all the political implications of that, and all the drawbacks that we're having to deal with now.
Well, David, I want to thank you for actually pushing forward in creating this documentary. And I want to thank you for, of course, writing the book on conversational evangelism. And most importantly, thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
It's great to be with you today, Kerby.
Let's, if I can, encourage you to go to the website. You're going to find links to all of those resources. As you go there, you'll see also my Viewpoints commentary today, talking about victory. We talked about all those victories yesterday. There's another one here. We've talked about it before in terms of dealing with the cancel culture, and it has to do with the story of Gibson's Bakery. And you can see the story there in which they received a judgment in their favor against Oberlin College. And so lots of times people say, how can I deal with the cancel culture? Well, here's just one more victory that we talk about. And of course, I mentioned quite a number yesterday. Maybe I'll do some commentaries on that as well. When we come back from the break, though, we're going to spend a little bit of time, first of all, talking with the former governor of the state of Tennessee, Bill Haslam. Faithful presence, the promise and the peril of faith in the public square. We're supposed to be salt and light, but at the same time, there have been a tendency for a lot of Christians to stay out of the public square. We are, as a nation, more divided than ever before. And so he's written this book in large part, first of all, to encourage us to take seriously our Christian responsibility as citizens, and also to maybe be wise about how to apply our biblical principles in the public square. So I think you'll appreciate that. Then we're going to get back into the issues in the news, because, of course, even recently, some various judicial precedents that we need to talk about, but all that is going to take place right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time, first of all, talking about how to be a faithful presence or witness in the public arena. We are called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world, but oftentimes we wonder, should actually Christians get involved in politics? Of course, you know the answer to that one if you've listened to this program, but how should we do that? And are there some ways in which we can make a difference? So we're going to focus on that, but then later this hour, get back to some of the issues in the news. Of course, the lead story that we'll be talking about for a few minutes, federal judge, that would be U.S. District Judge Catherine Kimball Mizell, has actually overturned the transportation mask mandate. We'll get into that. We'll get into a couple other issues of political censorship that are in the news, and that will be the end of the program today. But first of all, we want to talk about this book that's been out about a year, Faithful Presence, The Promise and Peril of Faith in the Public Square. It is published by our friends at Thomas Nelson, about 200 pages, and it is written by the former governor of the state of Tennessee. Bill Haslam was not only a two-term mayor of Knoxville, Tennessee, but also a two-term governor in Tennessee as well. Since that time, he's also served as the visiting professor of political science at Vanderbilt University, serves on the boards of a number of outstanding organizations like Teach for America and Young Life. So, Bill, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to the conversation. I appreciate you doing your homework.
Well, and we have enjoyed the book, 200 pages. Won't cover all of it. Maybe we'll get you on again to talk about some others, but you start by the fact that something we talk about all the time. This is a divided nation. We've talked about that with David French. We've talked about that with Kelly Shackelford. We've talked about it with Jonathan Haidt and a variety of other individuals. And in some respects, that division precedes Christians even getting involved in the political process. But your argument is sometimes as Christians seek to try to assert their values in the public arena, sometimes they tend to be more divisive, more contentious, but at the same time, we can use that to unify. So talk about that, because in some respects, that's why you wrote the book, isn't it?
It is. I had the opportunity to be a mayor for 8 years and governor for 8 years, and I loved the chance to do that. But let me start there. But one of the big disappointments to me was that Christians in the public square, and I include that not just people in office, but the people who engage on issues, that Christians act just like everyone else. And if there's one clear message, you quoted, we're supposed to be the salt of the earth and light of the world. If there's one clear message from the Sermon on the Mount, it's we're supposed to be different. Like the salt is supposed to be different than the meat. The light is supposed to be different than the dark, but we're not. And too many of us justify that by saying the stakes are so high, we're battling for the future of our country, that we don't have to follow what the gospel how the gospel asks us to act. And so the result of that, like I said, is that we've become like everyone else instead of being people who are what we should be, the salt that actually can keep the meat from going bad.
Well, and again, another aspect of that is, we're supposed to be the meek, if you will, because that's Sermon on the Mount. And people say, well, yeah, but meekness, as you say, doesn't have a chance. But there is a sense in which, if you think about this, you go through, and I'll pick Republicans for the moment that are sometimes even controversial, but whether it's former Governor and Senator Mark Hatfield or Bill Armstrong or people like that, they weren't flashy individuals, but everybody had just a great deal of respect for individuals. I guess I'm showing my age since I am actually older than you are, some of those individuals. But there is a sense that today we almost honor the loud, the brash, and those that have the Twitter post. And yet, in some respects, they are probably the worst representation of what should be a Christian involved in public service. Your thoughts?
Well, I think one thing we should know as believers in the public square is our call is not to out-argue the other side. It's not to win the argument it's not for conservatives to own the liberals, so to speak, as the saying goes on social media. It's to actually solve problems. It's to actually be who God called us to be here. And, the question I always start off with is this. In James, he says, wisdom that's from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, open to reason, full of mercy and good fruits. And if I said, if you and I walked out on the street and asked the first 20 people we saw, does that describe Christians in the public square? Absolutely no one would say yes to that question. Okay. Now, I want to be really clear. Meek does not mean weak. It does not mean we're supposed to just do whatever we need to get along. The whole wise as serpents and innocent as doves comes to mind. But it does mean that we're supposed to act in a way that's consistent with the gospel. If you think about it, in those of us who've been in churches for a long time or been in different Christian groups, we've been trained on a lot of different things. Like if we were in high school, we were part of a high school ministry that said, here's a way to act out your faith in high school. And the same thing in business or in your marriage. But very few of us have ever had the chance to sit down and talk about what does it look like to walk in a manner worthy of the gospel in the public square. We just don't have those conversations. So we know what our position might be on abortion or on marriage, but we really haven't thought, what are we supposed to act like? And the result, like I said, unfortunately, is too many of us acting just like the rest of the world.
One of the people that you quote with some frequency is Arthur Brooks, who's been on the program with us many times before. Of course, you quote his book, Love Your Enemies, How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. And there is, people are looking for a model. And if the only model up there are the people that get the most prominence on the so-called talking head shows, then that's not going to be so positive. But there are some very good role models out there. And perhaps, as you have in one of your chapters, you even tell your own story. Maybe you're one of those role models that say, okay, I can't quiet down some of the loudmouths out there, but maybe I can provide a more reasonable way of influencing the culture, learning to love my enemies, being able to make common sense arguments that will convince even my enemies, even my opponents, to say, I guess you're probably right about that one. And that's the better way to achieve some of those ends politically, aren't they?
Well, one thing to think about is this. Just think about your own experience. Have you ever been argued or ridiculed into believing the other side of an argument? No, right. I mean, you don't ever change your mind by saying, wow, that guy really put me down well on Twitter. I think I'm going to start seeing things his way, right? No, you just double down and you get madder, right? Yeah. And so unfortunately, we've kind of adopted that. Like if we can have the best put down, or if we can put up the best fight publicly, then we somehow have won the argument. But again, that we don't change our minds that way. Why do we expect anyone else would?
Yeah, I've said sometimes to some of these liberals that, and again, I'll pick liberals, but I can pick on conservatives in just a minute, but the liberals that just make fun of people all the time. And I'm saying, okay, you trying to win debate points, or you trying to convince me? Because there's nothing in your presentation that actually causes me to really want to pay attention to it, although I try to, because I want to understand why they said it in the first place. Anyway, we need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation on this book, Faithful Presence, right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
2 years ago, I did a commentary on how progressive activists were using the cancel culture to destroy the lives of individuals and drive small businesses into bankruptcy. One of the examples I cited was the plight of Gibson's Bakery. Although it has taken years, the bakery has finally won. The 9th District Court of Appeals ruled unanimously in favor of the bakery that accused Oberlin College of damaging its business and libeling it with false accusations of racism. The incident occurred in 2016, and the owners sued in 2017. A county judge ruled in their favor in 2019, and the appeals just came down in 2022. Sometimes the wheels of justice grind very slowly. The son of the bakery owner stopped 3 black Oberlin students because one of them was stealing wine bottles from the store. Students started protesting the bakery after the arrest by handing out flyers outside the store calling it a racist establishment with a history of racial profiling. The Student Senate passed a resolution accusing the bakery owners of being racist and emailed that resolution to all the students. And Oberlin College, who regularly purchased baked goods from the bakery for the dining hall, all of a sudden suspended its purchasing for at least a month after the incident. The Gibsons denied any wrongdoing and asked for a public apology from the college in order to repair the damage to their reputation. But apparently they never received one. When we discussed this case on my radio program, one of my guests applauded the bakery's response. Because, too often, victims of cancel culture cower in fear even when they haven't done anything wrong. So the bakery, I think, illustrates what happens when you stand up for your rights and stand up for your reputation. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Inflation, go to viewpoints.info/inflation. That's viewpoints.info/inflation.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with former Governor Bill Haslam for a little bit longer. Faithful Presence, the Promise and the Peril of Faith in the Public Square. And again, it is published by Thomas Nelson, 14 chapters, about 200 pages, great material. And one of the questions you ask, and you devote a chapter to it, is it hard to be a Christian in politics? And Bill, we are going to be having this 50th anniversary celebration because Point of View as a program started in 1972. Now we're in 2022, so 50 years of broadcasting, and we have speaking at that event Representative Michelle Bachmann and Dr. Ben Carson. And I want to ask the question of them, is it hard to be a Christian in politics? But you have experienced that first as a mayor and a governor. How do you answer that question? Well, guess we lost him. Anyway, we'll do our best to try to get him back on there.
Hey, I'm back. Sorry about that. Kerby?
Yes, go ahead.
I apologize. I'd hit mute while we were on the break. Yes, it is hard to be a Christian in politics, but I would say it's also hard to be a Christian lawyer and school teacher and parent because of what Jesus asks of us, and that's we're supposed to be people who lead with humility. And Paul says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider others greater than yourselves. Well, you'll definitely never hear that advice from any political consultant. And so, is it hard to be a Christian? Yes, because Jesus asks us to walk in a way that's both just and merciful and humble. And it's hard to figure out how to do all those things in public life. I learned really quick trying to be just and merciful at the same time is really hard. And I learned that when I had the chance to, pardon and commute sentences when those came before me, when I dealt with just a lot of issues. And to be honest with you, one of my takeaways is that as Christians, we actually have a head start on the world in solving that. How do you balance being just and merciful? And that we have a picture of that, and we just celebrated it last week in the cross. So we have a God that at the very same time was just and merciful. He had to satisfy his own holiness, but he had the mercy to send his own son to do that for us. And part of my argument in the book, and I do hope your listeners will read it, is that idea that Christians, rather than being handicapped in the public square, we bring a lot to it. Well, we bring the idea of how to be just and merciful at the same time. Paul tells us to speak the truth with love.
Right.
And you and I both know a lot of people who love speaking the truth, and they love being known as a truth teller. They don't do so well on the love part. And other people who are great on the love, but they're just a branch blowing in the wind on hard issues. And so, again, we have that idea. We're supposed to be both. We don't say, well, I'm going to be a truth teller and people might not feel loved by me. We don't really have that option, nor do we have the option to say, I'm just going to love everybody and not care about truth. Again, I think that as Christians, while it's difficult in some ways, we're uniquely suited to be public servants.
I think so. And again, I oftentimes say another way to look at it is we have our Christian convictions and we have our Christian compassion. And sometimes the evangelical church is real good on the Christian convictions, sometimes not on the compassion side. Sometimes the liberal church is good on the compassion side, not on the conviction side, but we need both. And so that is really important. Let me get to another chapter that I think is illustrative of the kind of question I'm sure you received. I'm sure you probably have never counted a number of times that said, wait a minute, you're a Christian. What about separation of church and state? And you have chapter 9 on the book, in which, first of all, you talk about some of the cases that we've actually discussed here on Point of View. But that is an issue because, unfortunately, as the culture becomes more secular, they almost say, I think as a Christian, you shouldn't be allowed to be in the public sphere because you have these religious values, always discounting the fact that people that have secular values have secular values as well. But you've probably run into this quite a bit. So how do you respond?
I do a lot, and your point is exactly right. All of us bring our worldview to the public square, whether we know it or not. We just do, okay? Regardless of whether you're a Christian, an atheist, Jewish, Muslim, you name it, you bring your worldview to the public square. Here's how I answer that. Our founders were brilliant. They were the first people, really, ever to say, religion's so important that we're not going to let the government play at all. We're not going to let them restrict. It says Congress shall make no law restricting the free exercise of religion. But we're also not going to let the government establish religion. Government, that's the establishment clause that people like to talk about so much in the Constitution. And that's true. I don't think as Christians we want a state-sponsored religion, because whenever the state takes over the church, it does not end well for the church. And we can point to Europe and hundreds, really anywhere in history where the state has been the church, it has not ended well for the church. But again, I think the beauty of our country is the government can't really play either way. They're supposed to not prohibit the exercise nor to establish. And I think that's a really good thing.
I think so, too. Well, again, one of the questions I'm sure, Bill, people would have is, well, okay, what does faithful presence look like? Now, you've already tipped your hand because one of them that you talk about in that chapter gets into the idea of speak the truth with love. But even the title of your book, Faithful Presence, begins with presence. In other words, you have to be present, and then to move beyond anger or withdrawal, but to be engaged, to consider everyone's neighborhood, to act justly, love mercy, walk humbly. In some respects, you're setting forth not only the problems, but maybe the demeanor by which we enter into the public sphere, aren't you?
Right. I mean, you actually nailed it, Kirby. That we're not supposed to assimilate. We're not supposed to become just like everyone else, nor are we supposed to withdraw, And there's one of my favorite passages in Jeremiah 29 where he's writing to the Israelites who are in bondage under Nebuchadnezzar, a really, really bad guy, okay? And he writes to him, he says, seek the peace of the place where you have been called. And he doesn't tell him, I'm coming to get you to rescue you. He says, you're going to be there a while, so build houses, plant gardens, marry your children, and seek the welfare of the place where I have called you. And I think we're supposed to do that too. We're supposed to seek the welfare of these places where God has called us. We're not supposed to just withdraw and be just our own little holy huddle, and we're not supposed to be like everyone else. We're supposed to seek the welfare wherever God has called you.
Well, again, just some great opportunities. Let me just mention, by the way, that this book is endorsed by all sorts of people we've interviewed on this program, like Russell Moore and Richard Stearns and Senator Ben Sass and quite a number of others. But just before we run out of time, what would you hope people could get from this book? Because I would want to hand this book to individuals thinking about running for office. We're right in the middle of midterms, and some people might say, well, I'm so involved in the campaign, I really can't think about how to make the case for what I want to do. But that's, I think, what we need to do. Take some time away and understand what it would mean to be a faithful presence in this public arena. So in some respects, all of us can read this book, but I especially want to hand it to individuals thinking about going into public service. What are your thoughts?
Well, I didn't write the book solely for people thinking about going to public service, because I think we're all called to be in the public square in some way. It's you leading discussions. It's the people who are listening to you, deciding how they're going to vote, and engaging in conversations about politics with the people they interact with. I wrote it to all of us who are frustrated and exhausted about where we are in terms of the political conversation in the country, and to Christians to say, maybe we can be the answer. Maybe we can actually be salt in this situation and be light in this situation instead of just being frustrated and exhausted. And I tried to point out some ways that I think we can do that, again, part of my experience from having been in office.
Well, again, I thank you for writing the book, and I know you're a busy individual, so thank you for giving us some time to talk about that. And I hope this isn't the only time we have you on Point of View. I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Well, I enjoyed the conversation. Again, thanks for doing your homework. You have no idea how many people interview you who have no idea what the book's about. So hats off to you for doing your homework.
Well, thank you. And I think our producer read it cover to cover, so you have a twofer there. Okay. Let's, if we can, though, take a break. We have some things to cover. And the first thing, of course, is we're going to talk about this decision by this federal judge. And I want to talk about the reaction to it, the negative reaction, because I think it's telling a little bit. Then we'll get into a couple of things. I've already kind of tipped my hand. We have posted the piece by Michael Brown about the idea that we should give up on God. Of course, you know what we're going to say about that. And a very good piece, well-written piece on the only way to fight disinformation is to fight political censorship. And so some great material that will be relevant to our conversation. And we'll have about a half an hour to try to cover a couple of topics. But if you find yourself saying, I'd like to call in and make a comment, you're free to do so. We'll have an open line here, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to find some more of this material, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour. If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let's talk for just a few minutes, and I won't be long, on the federal judge that decided to overturn the mask mandate. Now, before we get into the political parts and the legal parts of it, let's recognize that this might have been overdue anyway. There was a very significant reason to believe that the mask mandate might have been withdrawn, and the only reason it wasn't is that the CDC said they wanted to study it a little bit longer in terms of the most recent variant. And every time we turned around where the mask mandate should have been ended, it just got extended. So there is a sense in which this particular case, which was brought by the Health Freedom Defense Fund, might have been something that was long overdue. I don't claim to know a lot about airplanes, but I've had a chance occasionally to talk to some people that seem to know a little bit more about it than you and I do, and say probably one of the safest places for an individual would be in an airplane where the air is recirculated and filtered. But again, assuming that's true, you even you don't believe that, have to say, okay, I've been in enough airplanes over the last year now to say that as long as you're eating or drinking, you don't have to wear a mask. So I look around and see all sorts of people that take a long time to drink their drink or to eat their candy bar, whatever it might be, without a mask. So to say that that is okay, but then you have to wear the mask the rest of the time, I think we kind of know what's going on there. But there are some important issues to think about. First of all, the U.S. District Judge, that would be Catherine Kimball Mizell, has been roundly criticized by some of our liberal friends. And the argument has been, well, she was only appointed by Donald Trump. So there's one strike against you. Number two, she was, I think they said 35. So, well, she's not that experienced, and a number of other reasons. And then you have people complaining about how is it that one federal judge can issue an injunction that covers the entire nation? Well, I'm glad our liberal friends are raising the same question I've been asking for some time. You know, as long as the judges were saying things that supported Barack Obama, didn't hear a word about it, or if the judges were to strike down anything implemented by Donald Trump, no problem there as well. You have to remember that some very important regulations that were put forward by President Donald Trump to actually protect us. Let's for a moment say we don't want to allow individuals to come from countries where there's a high level of radical Muslim terrorist activity. That was then, if you might remember, one time struck down by one federal judge in, I think it was Seattle. Another time it was one in Hawaii. Issues of the building the wall and a variety of others. The liberal friends of ours never had a problem when one federal judge could issue an injunction that would affect the entire nation. Now, all of a sudden, they're getting upset about it. By the way, while I'm talking about that, it's probably wise to point out that if there ever was a place where a federal judge's injunction would have to apply nationwide, it would have to do with the issue of transportation. Could you imagine actually saying, well, this injunction only applies to the Ninth Circuit Court or only applies to the Sixth Circuit Court? Well, no, because this is a mandate that is applied to every airport and every airline in the country. So in some respects, if you were going to ever say there would be a justification for a national injunction, I think this might be it. But again, those individuals that have been so critical of her or of the action are not the same ones that seem to be all that critical of times in which you had one federal judge in one part of the country issue an injunction to prevent something from happening in the entire country. And I think that's worth a consideration. But nevertheless, she, in her opinion, points out a couple of very important issues. First of all, this mandate looks, and I've never really read it, so this is where we're learning after the fact, this mandate that comes from, of course, the president, Joe Biden, and his secretaries, actually is full of contradictions. And she also says it lacks specificity. Let me just give you one example. She said, quote, "It does not differentiate between kinds of masks based on their efficacy at blocking transmission. The rule did not discriminate between cloth masks or N95 medical grade masks, including only a footnote directing readers to the CDC guidance on attributes of acceptable masks." You would think that if indeed this was going to be something that was to actually address public health, there would be a little more specificity to it as well. She also points out in the ruling that the agency stretched the meaning of sanitation rather dramatically, and this, of course, has been the problem with individuals, whether it was in the Obama administration or now the Biden administration, to take words and to mean them, have them mean things that they didn't mean before. We've talked about the fact that the word sex now has been redefined according to the Biden administration to mean gender identity, when obviously it didn't mean that. When you have sanitation, this now applies to all sorts of things that need to take place on airplanes, include even masks. And most importantly, she quotes the words of a Chief Justice from the Sixth Circuit Court, that would be Justice or Judge Jeff Sutton, who said that the vaccine mandate case was no everyday exercise of federal power. In other words, it's pretty unusual to see that level of federal involvement, and yet nevertheless that has stood up until yesterday, which of course we now have the removal of the mask mandate. I think within the Biden administration there may be some criticism, but there may be some of them secretly saying, good, we like this. We didn't think we should have masks out there. We probably wanted to remove them. We didn't want to take the chance that we would alienate some constituencies. So now we can just blame the judge and get away with that. And so maybe they're secretly celebrating. I don't know, but it's at least a thought. Let me get to my next piece, because we talked about it yesterday, and because Michael Brown wrote about it, I thought it was good to actually include as our second article, because he points out back in April of 1966, front cover of Time magazine asked the question, "Is God dead?" This was just 2 days before Easter, and of course we have seen those kinds of editorials show up from time to time. So I guess we shouldn't have been surprised that on Good Friday, at a time when we are moving towards Easter, the first day of Passover, during Ramadan, you see this particular op-ed piece, "In the time of war, I propose we give up on God." And so he says, how deeply sensitive for the Times to actually post this anti-God essay on the day in which both Good Friday on the Christian calendar and first day of Passover on the Jewish calendar. What a nice touch from the editorial department. You've really outdone yourself. And he says, special shout out to the woman that put the graphic together, depicting God as an angry Godzilla-like giant marching through the city with terror on his mind. I mean, again, our friends at the New York Times have really outdid themselves as well. And so he spends some time talking about the man that wrote this, and he says, having followed the stories of some of the individuals that grew up in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish culture, some of them have, of course, been rejecting this idea of God for one reason or another. And yet he said it's interesting that they depend on this idea of God being unjust. But he points out from the classic C.S. Lewis article that C.S. Lewis said, my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe to when I called it unjust? And basically takes us through the fact that if you don't have the belief in God, you don't have a belief in moral absolutes, you really don't have a basis by which to even talk about something being unjust. It just is. Anyway, I got to love Michael Brown. He ends this way. As for Time magazine, just 5 years after that infamous 1966 cover, talking about When God is Dead, Time magazine put out another cover which announced the Jesus Revolution. And I hope we'll get Greg Laurie on the program here to talk about this new film coming out. But that's the year in which Michael Brown, a heroin-shooting, LSD-using 16-year-old Jewish hippie rock drummer, actually became a Christian. He says, I sense that he is about to reveal himself afresh today. The story might even make it to the front page of the New York Times. Be assured that he is not going away. And so it's a really good piece in which he talks about this movement from God is Dead to the Jesus Revolution and how he became a Christian in the midst of it as well. I've only summarized 3 pages, but you need to read it. It would be an encouragement to you by our good friend, Dr. Michael Brown. We'll take a break. Have more to cover right after this.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that tomorrow we'll have Danita Janae with us, and then on Thursday we have George Yancey with us, as well as Jill Stanek. Friday will be our weekend edition. I know we already have Dr. Merrill Matthews with us, and so we've got a lot to cover, and we'll do our best to try to cover those issues that are in the news. And I'll be honest, we've left a lot more on the table today because we only had about half an hour, but I got a little more time tomorrow, so we'll get into a couple of the other issues that I think are relevant to you. But I thought I would end by this particular piece. It's our third article. The only way to fight disinformation is to fight political censorship. And Stella Morabito actually argues that what we're starting to see right now is an opportunity to cover oneself. There's a nicer way to say it, but you know where I'm going with this. She says if outfits like the Aspen Institute's Commission on Information Disorder, can you believe this, along with big tech's faceless fact checkers ever get a total monopoly on dictating reality, the result will be a mix of falsehoods with an occasional limited hangout to cover up their lies. And she said a good example of that, of course, was what happened just recently at the University of Chicago. Now, if you're not familiar, there were a number of individuals there who were panelists talking about disinformation and wrongthink and the rest. And in the midst of this, and again, I'll give credit to one of these young men who asked the Atlantic's Ann Applebaum why indeed she did not actually cover and even go out of her way to prevent the coverage of Hunter Biden's laptop scandal. And she said, well, I just didn't find it interesting. And immediately they moved on because, again, there were at least a few people in the audience that weren't going along with this. Stop talking about disinformation. Stop talking about censorship when the best example of censorship happened just a month before the 2020 election, in which the New York Post was not allowed to even publish anything other than in their newspaper. They were not allowed to say anything on Twitter and had their Twitter account pulled. Anybody who talked about the Hunter Biden laptop had their account pulled, and there was an attempt to completely censor all of that. And as somebody the other day pointed out, not necessarily even a conservative, said, can you imagine if you changed the name Hunter Biden to, I don't know, Donald Trump Jr. or Jarrett or somebody like that, and it was instead related to, of course, Donald Trump? I don't think that you would get, what would they figure out? Media Research Center said, I think there was it was 48 seconds of coverage of Hunter Biden's laptop story in like a 6-month period or something like that. I mean, obviously, you could see how different it would be if it had something to do with Donald Trump rather than with Joe Biden. Anyway, she goes on to talk about censorship actually causes disinformation. She says it's the granddaddy of disinformation, not a solution to it. The sooner everyone recognizes this obvious fact, the better off we'll be. And she takes you through a couple of for instances, and I will, in the interest of time, not be able to go through all of those, but you can read this in its entirety. She says, for example, consider what happens if a society is only permitted one propagandistic narrative while all other ideas and information are silenced. Well, then people start self-censoring to avoid social rejection. The result is a form of imposed mental isolation. You know that in a company, if everybody holds to one viewpoint, you're less likely to surface a different viewpoint. And if a nation holds to just one viewpoint, you know that it's probably pretty unsafe to surface another one. The classic example is how, since most universities today, especially state universities, are very liberal, it can be quite costly to you, your grade, your academic performance, maybe even the possibility of becoming a tenured professor if you express anything other than the prevailing propaganda. And so the point she makes, I think, is easy to illustrate. And she then goes on to say that also propagandists guard their illustrations like magicians. I thought it was a great turn of phrase. She says, by definition, propaganda aims to psychologically affect people and change their attitudes. So our social survival depends on becoming aware of such phenomenon. Building self-awareness about our vulnerability to crowd psychology could serve as sort of a psychological vaccine. And of course, she says elites do not want us even entertaining the possibility that we can be manipulated or that we're vulnerable to social and psychological pressures. Of course, we know we are. As a matter of fact, anybody that doubts that needs to only look at what happens in a middle school, a high school, what happens in a uniform corporate environment or something of that nature. Anyway, she says, by and large, propagandists are illusionists by nature. If their illusion falls apart, then the game is over for them. That is why they depend so heavily on this slur of a conspiracy theorist. Because as soon as you see that, they'll say, well, you're just told into a conspiracy, because that's used to distract us from the truth and from the use of censorship to cut us off from other ideas. So then she quotes from a Nobel laureate, Doris Lessing, who spoke about the dangers of what's called social conformity in censorship back in 1986. This gets into some of the various aspects of social psychology, but she notes that there's a whole body of knowledge. There's a lot of research that has been able to look at what you might call crowd psychology and social contagion. And it was odd we weren't applying this knowledge to improve our lives because, again, Dr. Lessing concluded that no government in the world would willingly help its citizens resist group pressures and learn to think independently. We have to do it ourselves. Actually, a government is dependent on everybody thinking the same way. And actually, you, if you have to think differently, have to work on it on your own, maybe to use programs like this to help you to begin to think for yourself. And so she then goes on to say, fast forward to the 21st century, and it sure looks like the keepers of this secret knowledge use it as a means of social control. She says no sane person would want to live inside the box that the censors who claim to be fighting disinformation are building around us. If we want to escape this twilight zone existence, we must deny and destroy the canard and insist on real freedom of speech everywhere. Well, there's a different way to look at this, because if indeed you want to have free speech and you say, I don't like some of the misinformation or disinformation, the best antidote to misinformation or poor information is more speech, not less speech. But this looks at this whole idea of social psychology in a little more academic way to illustrate again how in some respects the only way, she says, to fight disinformation is to fight political censorship. When we get back tomorrow, we'll look at some of the interesting things that are starting to surface around the attempt by, of course, Elon Musk to buy Twitter. Whether he does or not, it has surfaced this whole issue of free speech once again, and certainly a very relevant conversation that we'll try to have tomorrow. Just before we run out of time, let me just mention that we have information about David Geisler and the movie Not Qualified, the story of Norman Geisler, and all sorts of great information that he has on conversational evangelism. And then we also have the information from the former mayor and former governor of the state of Tennessee, Faithful Presence, the promise and peril of faith in the public square. And it's all available on our website at pointofview.net. As always, I want to thank Andrew as our engineer, Steve as our producer, and I would encourage you to visit the website, listen to these things again, pass them on to others, and look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.